Well, hi, everybody. I'm Kevin Murphy. I am a digital accessibility consulting engineer here at Stanford University. And today I'm going to talk about making accessible data tables, specifically with HTML. Some of the design concepts will work with other programs, but I'm specifically, as this is WebCamp, I'm going to be specifically talking about web-based tables. Go to the next slide. Okay, so what are we talking about? I'll talk about some basic structure stuff, and there's some concepts beyond making simple tables. So a few design problems to avoid, and then there's a few other little tips and tricks I'll share at the end. Just two notes here that the examples I'm showing in this are not the only way to accomplish stuff. For most of it, it's just usually the simplest way. I've tried to make it just the simple way. Also, if you are looking at this PowerPoint deck in the future, many of these tables are intentionally not accessible in this PowerPoint, so don't blame me for that. That was intentional in order to make this presentation. So some of the tables may not be accessible. Okay, so the other thing I want to say is the reason I wanted to do this talk today is when I'm doing an audit of a website and I see a table on the website, 9 times out of 10, I know I'm going to be writing that up on my audit because it wasn't constructed correctly. And tables can be real simple, but there's just some concepts that people don't always get. And so that's why I really wanted to talk about this today. So let's talk about a table. Here's a data table. And it's just a nice, basic, simple data table. The actual data doesn't really matter here. But what I want to do is I want to focus in on this one cell. What does this cell mean? It's a 5, but that's not what it means. There's other pieces here that define what this is. The first thing is this up here, the title or the caption of our table. It kind of gives the big picture. But then we also have things like units. Okay, so we have a definition for what that 5 is. It's number of credits that this class is. But that isn't enough. There's another bit of information that has to be associated with that, and that's which class it is. And that's the part, that second one is the one that most people miss. That for every cell in our table, we have at least 2 things that define it. There's a column header and a row header for almost every single bit. And if you remember that it's that relationship, which is obvious visually, it was obvious that 5 is related to CS103. If you remember that, that's about 90% of what you need to remember with accessible data tables. So it's a reminder, you need to make programmatically what is obvious visually with our data structure. So how do we do that with HTML? Well, let's take a look at a table. Here's a basic table. The first thing that's going to be under there is going to be a caption. That is the title of our table. I'm going to talk more about this in a little bit, but basically, this is especially important if you have more than one table on your page. But even if it's just one table, this is it's kind of like the alt text of your table. Tells you what table it is. So if you're using a screen reader, you can find the table accurately. The next section is going to be a T-head section. This defines the headings, that first row. We're going to talk about that in a second. Then you have your T-body section, and your data is in there. And then there might be a T-foot section at the bottom. That is a summary row. That's not a place where you can put instructions. That's not a place where you can put anything else. It is a row for summary. So if you have a column that adds up at the bottom to a grand total, you would put that in the T-foot. I also just want to mention real quickly that it used to be in HTML that you could put it at the top, the T-foot at the top of the table, and it would still show up at the bottom. That's no longer true in HTML. It needs to be at the bottom of the table. So let's take a look at the T-head. What do we do to build this T-head? Well, here's the code for our T-head, and it's nice and simple. There is a TH for table header with a scope of column. And that's what defines our units. And the units one is that entire column of data. So far, so good. We also have then in our body, in the T-body section, we have, again, we have a TH with a scope of row. And again, this is the one that people miss all the time, is this scope of row to define the row. And that's what defines that direction. So the first thing that might be confusing for you is that the TH doesn't actually have to be the first one. It can be any one of those columns. So in this case here, it's the second one, and it defines both to the right and to the left of it. Now, if you're using Microsoft Word or PowerPoint or anything like that, you can't do this. And a lot of your things like the little WYSIWYG editors in like Canvas or in Drupal or something may not let you do this either. But if you can edit the HTML, you can absolutely put the scope of the TH with the scope of row as the second column or the last column or wherever you want to do it. Should be consistent throughout the entire table. Otherwise, you have some kind of weird table structure going on. But it does not have to be the first one. So if we back up and look at our table, it's really this simple to create a basic table. You have a table section with a caption. There's a T head, which has THs in it with a scope of column. You have T data section. The first one in this particular table is a TH with a scope of row. Then you have your data. The T foot, again, if you have it, looks exactly like the T data sections. It should look exactly the same. But again, it's really just for a summary of our table. And that is a basic table. You need all of those parts in order for it to be accessible. What if we need something that's a little bit more complicated? All right, let's go beyond making a simple table. The first thing we'll look at are what are called column groups and row groups. So we have here a table that has across the top a secondary row of headers, and that span multiple columns. And we can use column groups for creating this. How do we do this? Well, let's take a look at the T head section again. This is a little different in that first thing we do is we define those columns. And so we set up the columns first. This is outside of the row, notice. Then the next thing we do is we define those spanning THs. And they, instead of having a scope of column, have a scope of call group. So this is a group of columns. I also want to point out the fact that there's a TD in there. There's a table data cell in that first row. And that is that TD way up there in that left corner. It doesn't have any function. So therefore, we're going to use it as a TD and not as a TH, because we don't want to have it have any meaning. If we have a TH there, it's going to have meaning to it for a screen reader user. So we want to avoid that. And then finally, the second row of our column, or second row of our headers is just like it was on other tables. So just THs with scope of column. So that's how we do column groups. There's also row groups, which are even easier, because all you have to do is put a scope of row group and do a row span. So that's all you got to do for that. I got to be honest, though, when I've ever built tables, I've never actually done the call groups and row groups, because I've always been defaulted to the next technique, which is to use headers and IDs. So let's take a look at this table here. This is a much more complicated table. We can make this accessible as well, but we can't use the techniques we've used so far. So if we were to look at this piece of data here, this 3, what are the headers for this piece of data? Well, credits, all right. Fall 2023, yep. Art history 2, yep. Arts requirement, yep. We have 4 headers that define this cell. So how do we do that? Well, we use headers and ID values in order to associate any 2 cells with each other. So our top level header is going to be, again, a TH, and it's going to have an ID value. In this case, I just chose TH1 because it doesn't really matter what those ID values are as long as they're correctly formed and they're unique. Our subheader is going to have an ID value, and it's going to have a headers attribute that points back at that top level header. So it has got its own unique ID, and it references that other header. And then our data cells are going to have a headers attribute that reference all of the headers that are appropriate for that cell. So again, our top level header has an ID. Our subheaders have IDs. They also have headers that reference back to the first header, and our data cells have multiple header value, ID values in the headers attribute. Okay, let's look at that. Also, yeah, my note there. Note that I've removed scope when we don't mix scope and headers in the same table. We use one or the other. We don't use both at the same time. So what does that look like? Again, we're looking at this cell right here, the 3, and the code for that's going to look like this. So let me bring up my little laser pointer here. So this fall 2023, there it is. It's fall. It's a TH, and its ID is fall 23. This credits, which is a header, but it's also sub of fall 23. It's got an ID of CR, and it's got a header of fall 23. This cell down here has got a headers because it doesn't need to have an ID, and it's referencing fall 23 credits. It's also referencing art history 2, and it's referencing requirements. So that's how we build a complex table with using ID values and header attribute to create all the little parts of a table. And again, we can then put pretty much whatever headers are in there, no matter where they are in the table. And if we're doing this right, we can associate pretty much any header, any cell with any headers. The order of those values do affect the reading order for a screen reader. It will read them in that order. So you might want to think about that as well while you're building those, as you're putting them in. And again, this is the one that I do when I'm building any kind of complex table, is to use this technique, especially if it's coming out of a database, because you can easily just do TH1, TH2, TH3, TH4, and just create your unique values that way. So if you're generating over 100 rows, you just have 100 values. It's just a counter and it adds up. Okay. So that's all the HTML I'm going to talk about. Now I want to talk about things that can be problems with your data. How you can build a table incorrectly, even if you have done all the HTML correctly. And the first thing is, don't mix data. Each table should be a unique bit of information. Here is a table I built for a baseball game, and I've got wins and losses and starting pitchers in the same table. I see this kind of thing on occasion, where there's bits of data in a table that doesn't belong together in the same table. So something to keep in mind. The next one, I bet you've probably all seen this exact example when you've been looking at things at universities, like at Stanford. This is an ambiguous data relationship between the headers and the data. That first row, econ 43, that one's fine. But the second row, econ 1 and econ 1v, or econ 17n, how is that going to get read to a screen reader? Well, it's going to get read like this: econ 1 and econ 1v dash or dash econ 17n, principles of economics, lab energy, the environment, and the economy 314. How can you tell that econ 17 is a 4-credit class? You can't, because of this is a very ambiguous data relationship between the header cells and the data cells. It's not a single line item for a piece of information. So some people will come along and say, oh, I have a solution for this. You know what I'll do is I'll build a table, and then I'll stick another table inside it for that bit of information. This is a really bad idea. This is a concept here where you have taken bits of data and shoved it into another table, a table inside of a table. So now, which headers go which pieces of data? Does this header relate to this information? Well, it should, but it doesn't, because they're in separate tables. So, in short, don't nest data tables ever. Each data table should just be a single table. In HTML, it is permissible to put a table inside a table, but for accessibility, don't do that. Always just have a single table worth of data. Splitting and merging cells is problematic. This is actually, I just tested this when I built this particular example with a screen reader on a web page, and JAWS actually read it pretty well, I have to admit. But I tried the same thing in Microsoft Word, and it didn't. So again, this is more of a Word document thing than a HTML thing. But splitting and merging cells can create breaks between the relationship between the data and the headers that are associated with it. Again, JAWS actually read this one real well. I was actually very pleased with how JAWS read this, but something to be aware of and to be careful about is making sure that your data relationships don't break with by checking out your cells, or splitting into your cells. Another one we see all the time, you've got a table and there's a little triangle next to one of the rows, and you click on it and it expands out and shows you more stuff. This is actually a big problem because how is this data related to what? Again, we've broken our relationship between our cells, our header cells, and our data cells. There's that relationship is very complicated now. Could you make this accessible? Maybe you might be able to do that, but probably it wouldn't ever be able to be accessible. So something to keep in mind that, you know, doing stuff like this where you break your break the layout to expand and show more information, you'll have to deal with it very, very, very carefully. And the last little bit under this section is a couple of other layout problems. Don't mix data and layout. This is one I see a bunch where you take and throw in a row because you want to put in a search the table. So you put this in one of the rows. And again, that creates a break of the data relationships between the headers and the data. So don't mix your layout and your data. And this relates back to the previous example as well. At the same time, also, don't put in empty rows or columns. That's not the way to put space in your table. That's what we have CSS for. If you need to put some extra space in a table, well, you can use margins or padding, depending on what you're trying to do. But don't put empty rows and empty columns. And especially don't ever have an empty TH, or because that will be reported to assistive technology that this is a header, but it's not a header with any values. So a few little tips and tricks to go take your tables and make them go beyond the basics here. I mentioned the caption before, and the caption functions like a heading of a table. Most screen readers will read the caption for a table, but there's other ways to accomplish the caption. That caption element as the first HTML child of table, that's the simplest way to do it. But what's about it in this case here, where we have a heading, which is grade report fall 2002, that's an H3, and it's really what the title of this table should be, because we've put this heading over this section. Well, so there's our heading. Well, I could put an ID on it. Then we have some other HTML. And then under the table, we can say, oh, you know what? I just want to reference that heading that already exists on the page. There's a table, and I'll just say ARIA labeled by equals table H3. So I've just referencing back to that H3 that already exists on the page. So I don't have to have the same content there twice. I would point out too that the labeled by is the British spelling of labeled by. If you ever are doing that in ARIA, don't use the American spelling. There also is what used to be in HTML was a summary, and it used to be in HTML4, you would always need to remember to put in a summary of your table. That was another accessibility piece. Summary has been removed from HTML5, so that's no longer something you should do. But if you should have a summary, and a summary really is a longer description about what information is going to be presented in your table. So it's a long description of, this is what I've got in this table. This is where, how the information is going to be organized, et cetera, et cetera. I very rarely see actually a table that needs a summary. If you've structured your table correctly, you probably don't need a summary on it. It should be self-evident, but I can see why you might need to do that at some point. So again, we're going to use ARIA. We're going to use ARIA described by in this case, and we will point that at the paragraph that is somewhere on the page that describes the content of the table. That will then say, okay, you know what, this is the description of this table, is whatever paragraph this is. Now you could make that paragraph off-screen text, not display none, but off-screen, with your off-screen text techniques that you do with accessibility. But again, it doesn't have to be there, right there, part of that table. It can just be a paragraph somewhere else. And I noticed just now that I've got a span there at the end of that, and it should be a paragraph closing tag. I will fix that before I post this. Okay. Another technique that you might run into, and this one actually you might want to do. Let's say we have a table like this, and this is one of the few table examples that doesn't need a row header. It does have column headers, but it doesn't really need a row header, because what are you going to say about each row? It's one, like I said, it's one of the few table designs where you don't actually have that. So the header for the number 17 is going to be T. Is that Tuesday or Thursday? Hard to say. Visually, it's very easy to see, oh, that's Thursday. I can pick out that, oh, that's going to be Thursday. But if I'm using a screen reader and I'm on the 17 cell and I say, what is my header? And it's going to say it's T. Not enough information. And so we might want to make our table headers have more information than what's presented visually. And we do that with ARIA again. In this case here, we'll do an ARIA label, and we will say that we'll do the full names of our table headers, and that will replace what is in what's there visually, even when you're down on the cells. So if I'm on 17 and I say, what are my headers? It will say Thursday, not T, if I do the ARIA label on the TH. We can also do the opposite. This is an interesting technique. Let's say we have a table like this. And when I'm down on the table and I'm getting the table headers, I don't want to get the whole Granny Smith apples. I just need to know that it's apples on the lower levels. In which case, then I can use an abbreviation on the TH. I can say, this is a TH with a scope of column, and the abbreviation for it is apples. For the Granny Smith apples column. The long version of that, Granny Smith apples, will be read when you are focused on the TH itself. So when you're focused on Granny Smith apples, it'll read Granny Smith apples. But when you are down lower in the page on the number 1 there, for example, it will only say apples. So if you want to make it shorter, a shorter version of that same bit of content, well, you can use the abbreviation tool to do that. This works if the abbreviation is unique and informative. And this is something that you need to think about when you're building your tables in general, is that all of your THs really need to be unique. They need to have some kind of unique bit of information so that it's easy to understand, especially your column headers. Occasionally you'll have a row where it's the same row header on multiple ones, but for the most part, you want to make sure that every one of those THs is unique. And if you do this with the abbreviations, that also needs to be unique. So if we were comparing Granny Smith apple and Fuji apples, and we used apples as the abbreviation both times, well, that wouldn't help. That would also cause confusion. So we want to make sure that that bit of information is unique each time.
So Kevin, your example of a month where you have Tuesday and Thursday and both are T, could you use abbreviation and say Tuesday and Thursday?
You could, but in this case here, I would probably do the ARIA label as the longer version. The ARIA label will be read every time on the header and on the data cells, whereas the abbreviation is only read on the data cells. That makes sense.
Yep.
And semantically, the abbreviation is supposed to be a short version of something. So semantically, I would say you should do it that way. Another thing to do with tables is to, and this is just, this is probably obvious to a lot of people, is to use them in conjunction with charts and graphs. You visually have a chart or a graph on your table, on your page here. You know, if I'm just looking at that bar chart visually, I can kind of get all the details. But if I'm using a screen reader, I'm going to have a real hard time fully understanding that information. So in which case, have a table. So use a table to provide the equivalent information that's presented visually. And you can take this table and make it visible for everybody, make it only visible for users of assistive technology with a hidden link or something. But however you do it, you can make that information available to the screen reader users. Honestly, though, looking at this, I would know the difference between the one topping on on a small pizza versus an extra large pizza. It's a value of 4.3 versus 4.5. I can't really see the difference in there. So I like to see that the detail information. So make that table available to everybody. It might be better. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about, and I am going to demonstrate one little technique for examining your tables to making sure they work, which I'll do on our webpage. But the last thing I want to talk about is using CSS. You can break your table. This is one of the only places where what value you put in your style sheet actually will affect the accessibility tree of the document. If you say table style display is block, it's no longer a table to assistive technology. And again, this is a thing that is really rare in how the accessibility tree is built in our pages, that a style breaks the accessibility tree. Other than things like display none or something like that, which just renders it so it's not rendered to assistive technology. But this one actually just changing the style makes it so that this is no longer a table to a screen reader. In addition to display block, other things like grid, flexbox, there's a whole bunch of different things that you can apply here to this table and make it no longer a table. And the opposite is also true. You can take a div and turn it into a table. This will now report as a table. This is step one of about 45 steps in order to turn a series of divs into a table and make them accessible. Yes, it is possible to make a table without the table elements. It is absolutely possible to do that. Not advisable, except in certain circumstances, but it is possible to do that. But just doing this part isn't enough. How do you do that with CSS ARIA table? I don't have time to do the entire explanation here, so I'm just going to show it to you. This is the CSS that generates an accessible table without table elements. You have to put just display type on a whole bunch of different div types, row group, table caption, table cell, on a whole, like I said, on a whole bunch of different things. And then your HTML ends up looking like this, where you have a div with a role of table. Inside that is a row group. Inside that is a row. Inside that is a row header. Inside that is or next to that is a cell. Like I said, you can absolutely make a table without divs. Without table elements, and use divs instead. Why would you do that? Well, the only really good use for that is if you are doing responsive design and you want to have a single table that changes based on the screen size, changes what information is there. I use divs in this case here, but I could have used spans. There's a whole bunch of different things that I could have done instead. So I could have done spans, and they could just flow differently then, depending on if it's on what size screen it's on. So you could use this to make an accessible table that is not as rigid as a HTML table is. And that's all I've got. Like I said, I want to demonstrate one thing real fast with tables. So I'm going to break out of my PowerPoint. So is there any questions while I'm loading this up? So I actually just added all this stuff to our the Office of Digital Accessibility's website, and there's a few bits that are in my presentation that aren't on these pages yet, but they will be sometime in the next few days, as soon as I get a chance to add these other little bits of detail. But how do you know if this table is built accessibly or not? Well, the easiest way is to use the ANDI tool. This is from the Social Security Administration. So if you search for ANDI SSA, you'll find the ANDI tool. It's basically just a JavaScript that you run in your browser. And it's going to load up like this. And I'm going to say, where are my tables? Take me to the first table. And take me to, actually, I want to go to the previous table. So it's a TH, it's got a text of name, and the important part is the ANDI output is name. That's what's going to be read to a screen reader user. It's a TH and its value is name. TH volume of start year, end year. So when we're looking at these kind of ones, we can see that it's a header. It's still a TH, but it's got a header of name and then the name. Let's move over one. We can see in the ANDI output the 3 bits of data that are important here. We have it's the start year, it's John Casper Branner, and then the value is 1913, because this is a TH with a scope of column, this is a TH as a scope of row. So again, use the ANDI tool to inspect your data tables and make sure that all of that bits of data are in there. Now, like I said, you can build a accessible table with CSS. This is an accessible table with CSS. If you go and look here, and here's all that code I just I showed you. And again, I'm going to use the ANDI tool to look at my table. I'll look at this cell, and even though it's nothing but divs for this table, it still reports correctly. There's a header, header 2, there's a header, row 2 header, and then the data. It's all there. And if you look again, if you look at the code for this, inspect the code, it's a div with a row of column header. And again, there's just a bunch of CSS back there to do the display and make it turn it into a table. But that's all there as well. Are there any other questions? I will just remind you that we're available, our content's available at accessibility.stanford.edu. If you're in the Stanford community, we have the accessibility and site improve Slack channels, and we also have office hours on Tuesdays and Thursdays. General accessibility questions on Tuesdays, and I run the site improve one on Thursdays. So with that, that's it. Thank you all for attending.